All right, everybody, welcome to our program, Zoom into Archaeology. I'm Mike with the Florida Public Archaeology Network in our coordinating center in Pensacola. And today we're really happy that Melissa Timo is here to give her what I know will be an awesome talk, Standing for Sacred Spaces, African American Cemeteries, and Community Engagement. And so what I want to do really quickly is just do a quick introduction for Melissa and then hand it off to her. And so Melissa is currently the staff archaeologist and historic cemetery specialist with the state of North Carolina's Office of State Archaeology. She actually received her uh, BS degree in anthropology and archaeology and her master's degree in historical archaeology with an emphasis on public archaeology from the University of West Florida in Pensacola, Florida in 2013. So we know Melissa well. Her master's thesis focused on the maintenance of memory, tradition, and cultural landscape by examining a 19th century African-American cemetery in Bay County, Florida. And before she joined the Office of State Archaeology, she worked in the private sector. She worked for the Florida Public Archaeology Network, the National Park Service, local historical societies, university archaeology labs and field schools, and the Sagamore Institute of the Adriatics at Vanderbilt's Great Camp Sagamore. Hopefully I said that right, probably didn't. So she's got a lot of experience, a lot of really great experience. She has a passion for connecting people to their local history, historic cemeteries, and archaeological resources. And so welcome, Melissa. Thanks for being here. And I look forward to hearing all about this.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, again, Melissa Timo. I have been with OSA for about a year and a half now. I spent 3 years in Pensacola with FPAN Northwest, and then I was 4 years with FPAN in Fort Myers in FPAN Southwest. So I'm very happy to be back here speaking to you all for FPAN. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that has become sort of very important for me, both professionally and personally. This is combines all of my loves, the love of working with descendant communities and public outreach, as well as cemeteries, because as you probably, if you're here, you're probably familiar with cemeteries, and you know that cemeteries are interesting landscapes. They're not just things, they are people, essentially. So that's how we're going to approach the talk today. Cemeteries are interesting for their value as objects, but they are cultural landscapes. They are sacred landscapes, and they are landscapes that are especially important for people like African American communities whose history has not always been recorded or recorded well. So we're going to be looking at these in that lens of sort of this bridge between the past and the present. So we are going to cover a number of different topics, and we're going to sort of talk about these places within their context and then bring them forward to the community. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. So I'm going to focus a lot of the first part of this talking about sort of the cultural identifiers on early pre-emancipation, just post-emancipation cemeteries, because as we move from the late 19th into the early 20th century, we see a very move towards standardization, move towards the mainstream. That doesn't mean that traditional practices were lost. That just means that sometimes they're more muted. So by talking about these oldest places from their first arrival into this part of the world, then we can see the evolution of these traits and be able to identify them when we visit today. And I'll show you some examples of some really cool old traditions and how they changed over time, because even if they are a part of beliefs that you don't necessarily personally believe in anymore, these old things become part of your accepted, we'll call it aesthetic of how things should look. So by learning how to identify these features, you'll be able to spot them once you're out in the wild, so to speak. So the first thing to look at is are these old cemeteries? Where were they? How do we know about them? But knowing about them also means we start to understand the communities that created them. So we have to combine the living people with the stuff. And it's especially tricky for communities like the enslaved African American population of this country, because they couldn't write down their history. So gathering tidbits to understand practice, something that's not tangible, beliefs that are not tangible, it gets a little tricky. So it's a combination of looking at the material culture, looking at what a few documentary resources we have, which is usually involves a really sizable grain of salt and reading between the lines, as well as talking to the descendant communities, talking to them about their memories. We're able to put together a picture of what these places are and what these places mean. And ultimately, that's the most important part. So these are sort of looking at the past, these are sort of the topics that I'll be covering: history of the practice of burial and usage of this landscape, where on the landscape these places were, what did that look like, how do you expect to find people within the cemetery, and then the things on the surface, the markers, the plants, the material goods. All of these little clues put together will help us understand the people in the past and the people now. So the thing about looking at this is these are places of death, at least tied in with the deceased. And for the enslaved communities, death was pervasive. It was all around you. Working conditions were awful. Healthcare was not great. And so we do see these mortality rates that mean that this aspect of culture was something that they had to address constantly. They also ran into the problem that they were enslaved, so their movements were directed and regulated. And that even went down to when funerals could be hosted. And in most parts, if funerals were permitted, they were only allowed during non-productive times, so late at night, when there was no way to work. So they were sort of, all of this was controlled, but these funerals were often were one of the few times where they were allowed to gather in groups. Some states you weren't even allowed to, if you were an African American, an enslaved African American, you weren't allowed to gather in groups larger than 3. But during a funeral, these privileges or these strictures were sort of loosened. So they were able to gather in large groups. And if you're gathered in a large group, at night, out of the eyesight of the overseers, then this is a fantastic opportunity for all kinds of cultural expressions to not only survive, but be taught to the younger folk and to be passed on to future generations. So that includes things like music and language and dance, social structures, and these are things that came from where they came from, but also new structures that were built, new traditions that were built in the face of their previous worldviews being torn apart by enslavement. Now, we do see a little bit of evidence of this, and this is one of my favorite awful quotes, where this daughter of a slave, of a plantation owner, wrote about a funeral happening at night, and that, my favorite is, that they do everything at night in the dark, showing that their deeds are evil, which is hilarious because, of course, that was the only time they were permitted to do this. But from that, I get the music, the drums, and the nighttime evidence to help me understand how these processes happened or how these traditions played out. So funerals are, and this type of traditions related to grief and pain might also be something that you don't write down normally. But if it's not just a private thing, but if you are an enslaved people, that's definitely not something that you are gonna write down necessarily. So like I said before, we're gonna try to match all of these documentary evidence and physical evidence, that you'll see in a minute, together in order to understand what was happening. So these are a few of the quotes from different sources throughout the Southeast, and we can pull some clues to help us understand and match to what we see in the ground as archaeologists, what was happening around, going to, and in the cemetery. So we can see, because I will sometimes get questions from people, well, you know, did they use coffins? What kind, did they have hearses? What sort of things were happening as an enslaved person to make it a funeral? And we can see from a number of sources who was making it. We can see some of the ceremonies of large gatherings of people, torches, water. We can see all of these sort of symbols coming together to help us form a picture of what was happening in the past. But they all have sort of these similar ideas of nighttime, 11 o'clock at night, twilight, after the work hours, and the community coming together to celebrate this person and celebrate themselves as a community, or commemorate themselves as a community. So where were they going? They leave the village or where their homes were, and where, if we look at the landscape, where would we find a cemetery attached to an enslaved population in order to get more clues to understanding their lives and the traditions that they've passed on? Well, again, because things were very regulated, we do have some patterns that we're seeing throughout the Southeast and into the Caribbean that will help us predict where we might find these resources. And again, because like regulated non-working hours, we also have to look at non-productive land as one place where we might find an enslaved community cemetery. Along borders and boundaries, marshy land, scrubby land, rocky land, something that can't be farmed or have a business on top of, that was okay. Which is completely different to where we see some other cemeteries at the same time, a nice church cemetery on top of a rise with a very nice view, which is sort of, might think of as, well, that this is awful that they were shoved into this bad land, especially a quote a couple slides back when it said that some of the graves were filling with water, much to their horror. But it helps us as researchers help to more easily identify where these places are. Another place that you might find enslaved people and people just after emancipation, these both use the same places and reuse the same places, would be in a segregated section, usually just outside the fence or just behind an established white family cemetery. So that it was all kept together, but they were separate. And this plays out, this isn't just something that you see in the Southeast. This is sort of a pattern you see throughout the Americas. This is the African Burial Ground in New York City. It's now a national monument, I believe, or a national park. It's under NPS, somewhere under there. This was a cemetery for free and enslaved people that operated 1690 to 1790, you see up there. Somewhere north of 20,000 individuals are buried in this cemetery. And you can see the red circle there. That is where the where the African Burial Ground was located. And that solid line just to the left of it was literally the city wall. So they literally put them just outside the wall, sort of out of sight, out of mind. This marginal land nobody was using, outside the wall, nobody could see it. Completely different landscape. We go down to Barbados. This is a plantation, Newtown Newton Plantation, and you can see the enslaved village, community village, was on the right-hand side there in that scrubby bit, and then the cemetery was in that left-hand scrubby bit. It's very rocky, and not usable for agricultural purposes. And you see the buildings in the front there, that is where the hub of business there. That's where buyers and planters came and went. So that means that cemetery is off and away, out of the way, out of sight, and not impacting the productivity of that plantation. So again, that's all fitting within that same pattern. Let's try a sort of example. So this is a cemetery that I worked on in Bay County, very North Bay County, almost Washington County. And this enslaved community approached FPAN for help with their family cemetery, and they knew that their family had been in the Panhandle a long time. They were brought as enslaved people sometime between 1809, 18 teens, long time. But this particular cemetery, they weren't sure if it was associated, and the cemetery is in this, is in that square right there. They weren't sure if this cemetery was associated with their enslaved ancestors or with the post-emancipation community. And when I looked at it, I had questions about whether it was, because it wasn't fitting the pattern. So if you can see this faint dotted line that runs all the way from north to south on this picture here, that's the St. Andrews to Georgia Road. So William Gaynor, the property owner, prominently put his house right up there near the waters and on the road, a very prominent place for a prominent man. If we can look at this Google Earth image, you can see the yellow push pin is the cemetery, and then the red push pin is the approximate location of where William Gaynor's house homestead had been. So that meant that if you were traveling up this very prominent road from the Bay through Georgia, if this was the enslaved community cemetery, before you saw the house, you would see this African American community cemetery, which gave me pause. And when I combined the physical evidence that I found later, the artifacts, the family stories, it looks more like this is not the enslaved community cemetery. It's not matching the pattern. It's associated with the post-emancipation freedmen community and their church and their school and the houses that surrounded that community. So we aren't really sure where the enslaved community was buried, but it was probably not here. Now, layout is not something that people necessarily think of when they think of cemetery studies, because you go into a cemetery, you know, mom is here, dad is here, Aunt June is over here. There's an obvious ebb and flow. There's a pattern to the way the cemetery is laid out. But when you're only restricted to a narrow strip of land, very there's lots of regulations based around where you bury, things change a little bit. So that's frustrating for a modern researcher, especially someone looking at genealogy and tracking individuals, but it ends up reflecting sort of a really beautiful community tradition of an importance being on community rather than the individual. The importance on making sure that there's room for everyone, whether they're bloodkin or whether they're made family, that everyone fits in the same place rather than tracking individuals. Because if you track individuals, if you make sure there's an individual space for every person, that means a cemetery can fill up. And what happens if you're an enslaved community and your cemetery fills up? Will you be allowed to have another place? You may not know. So thinking about it, putting aside the modern need to track individuals and thinking of it as a celebration of community sort of changes the way you can approach places like this. Which also means that the layout of graves can be kind of wonky. We do see lines, we see east-west orientation because that fits both Christian burials as well as a lot of West African, especially West African religions. The east-west orientation is important. But inside of it, we see a mixture of all kinds of things. You see rows, you see clusters, you see some overlapping, you see all kinds of variations. There's even, I've spoken to some researchers, some archaeologists who have seen the adults are in the middle and the children are around the outside. So this great variety of layout styles doesn't fit a modern landscape, but it does, again, still speak to this idea of an emphasis on community rather than individuals. And even after the emancipation, people asked to be carried back home, quote unquote, back home to where their kin were, because that place was essentially theirs. Even if they didn't own it, that was their kin, their blood. So that's where they wanted to be brought in. Now, markers are also something that people, especially who love cemeteries and genealogy, like to focus on, because you get so much great information from markers. You can get, of course, names and ages. You can get family relationships. You can get all kinds of great clues from the headstones. And with African American communities, especially those further back in time, that can be sort of another thing that you have to readdress, put in view from a new lens, because it's not always the case that you can be guaranteed markers, especially during an era where some communities weren't legally allowed to be able to read and write. So there may not be someone to be able to create a stone with a marker, let alone the cost of such a thing. So we see oftentimes where, especially between practice and then time, cemeteries that don't look a whole lot like cemeteries. For example, this cemetery over in the mountain area of North Carolina in Asheville, where they do have some fieldstone markers, but not a one of those are marked. So the clues can be very subtle to learn about the community, but we can still gather some other clues when there are markers. So for example, we're going to look at this marker. This is also from that Gaynor Historical Cemetery that I spoke to you about before in Bay County. And this is a handmade poured concrete marker. And there are lots of great clues on this. First, we're going to talk about the letters. It's sort of a standard shape, not much to say there, but the letters are interesting because they were made with a kit, a stamp kit. And you can see that there are some issues, particularly if like you look at the number 6 in 1946, that 6 has a defect. The letter was broke, or the number was broken. And the interesting thing is that this same set with this defect I found at several different cemeteries across the region. So that's interesting to me, because I then have to ask the question, did one man go around making all these headstones, or was this set passed from community to community? And if it was passed from community to community, then you know there's got to be lots of cool cultural connections, family connections, business connections, stretching across a region. So that's very interesting to me. We also have spelling. You might notice gone but not forgotten, and the forgotten has an O instead of an E. Misspellings, which are important to write as is if you're recording a cemetery, don't fix what it should be, because the misspellings are interesting. They do speak to education level, of course, but I like them because often misspellings are phonetic. So if you can't remember how to spell a word, you sound it out. And if you say misspellings out loud, sometimes you hear an accent, which is kind of a cool, this is not an official anything, but a linguistic stance. But that's kind of a cool connection between a person in the past and something that you may never be able to reach out to, which is their voice. So that's a cool thing to make sure you record as you see it, because you never know what clues you'll be missing. And then finally, if you see my trowel there, just above and below the trowel, you see shells. Shells we'll talk about in a minute. But this cemetery is about 45 to 50 miles away from the beach. So this has to be an intentional choice to put these shells there, which is an interesting clue about who these people are. These markers are from, the one on the left is from Gaynor, and the others are from further south in Bay County in Panama City. These are markers. While Willie Gaynor's marker was a sort of nondescript shape, these are very purposeful shapes that have a deep history. So we see the one from the Gaynor Cemetery, and then these two from the Millville Cemetery, and there's actually two, they're front and back. You can see they're all shapes like people, although the one in blue is sort of a pointy-headed person. But this is a tradition that comes straight from Africa. It's an evolution of a tradition. They're less styled, they're more stylized than you can see these ones from Ethiopia. But this is something that tracks across the ocean into the southeast. And they're usually associated with African American communities. Plants are another thing to look out for. Plants are helpful in general, especially for identifying graves in places where there aren't any markers. Grass will grow differently when there's a depression. But some of these plants were sort of traditional plants, or American versions of traditional plants, have the same look or the same feel, that represent traditional practices from places across the ocean. So you can look for things like periwinkle, the love grass, the yucca. These things, I know that St. Michael's Cemetery in Pensacola 10 or 12 years ago, they were studying the love grass. You can see there at the picture down below. The love grass, and trying to match that to African American graves in St. Michael's Cemetery in Pensacola. But these things are important because they may be the only evidence left that a grave is there. And I know under North Carolina law, plants like this are protected as being memorials. I can't remember under Florida law. So these are especially helpful for areas like, you can see this Virginia cemetery in the top left-hand corner, where things have become overgrown. They help you identify, and they talk about the traditional practices employed in the past, and sometimes are brought forward to the present. On the complete opposite end, we have the tradition of swept floor or scraped cemeteries. And Gaynor Historical Cemetery was a swept floor cemetery. The descendant family I was talking to talked about that as being part of their cleanup day, was to go through and remove all the vegetation. And this may tie to domestic practices that you can see in villages. You can also see it in places like Kingsley Plantation in the east coast of Florida. There were some swept floor practices there that sort of migrated into the funerary realm. Again, looking at this as sort of reframing these places, and also looking at them as community spaces for modern folk, I want you to also think about the fact that there's not any rules for what a cemetery, quote unquote, should be. So addressing the vegetation in a uniform fashion, that all cemeteries should look like those nice, pristine, open lawn cemetery, is not always a necessary action as far as looking at it from a historic preservation standpoint. It may not be valid for the past people who created this place. It's also very difficult to maintain, especially for places like this that are reliant on friends groups or have difficulty obtaining funding to take care of the cemeteries and within the modern communities. Cemetery maintenance is hard and it's expensive. So looking at them under a new light might be the way to go. For example, this is my favorite example. This is over in St. Louis, Missouri. It's the Greenwood Cemetery. Azura Cox is a landscape architect who presented a plan for how to address this particular traditionally African-American cemetery. And it's one of those big old cemeteries, hundreds and hundreds of graves, has gotten overgrown dramatically over time. And keeping a lawn was not very practical. So what Ms. Cox did to address this is she created a plan where she split the cemetery in 3 sections. Her plan was to move the entrance to another part of the cemetery. And in that part of the cemetery, as sort of an invitation for the modern community to come in and use the space, her plan was to turn that portion of the cemetery grounds into a food forest, to plant fruit trees and nut trees to encourage people to come and visit the space, not make this a creepy, unapproachable space. Part of the cemetery would also be left as sort of a prairie or open lawn style. And then the back half that the Friends group hadn't got a chance to clear out yet, her plan was this. You can see this picture here where kind of leaving it alone, more or less, clearing out some of the undergrowth and then highlighting the graves with these circles of pea gravel so that it is easier maintained, but definitely provides a different sort of feel, a sort of a different ambiance, a more contemplative maybe ambiance to come and visit this space, to think about the past or to get away from living in a city, a big bustling city like St. Louis. So I thought that was a really cool way to approach modern cemetery management. And if you either screenshot this link or visit the video later, it's a really interesting article about her process there. The last thing is material goods. And when you think about African-American cemetery studies, you hear a lot about material goods as a cultural identifier. And these are things that have been left on the surface that are usually very mundane almost, sort of practical things, but they're all sort of been imbued with this power, this symbolism. So we see natural items like shells and stones and water elements, and everyday things, bottles, personal items. You can see in the upper right-hand corner that little mug with a dog on it, which is a very fun find from the Gaynor Cemetery. Very personal items, and all of these things tie in with spiritual beliefs. Now, some in the past, you can see a number of these graves. Some researchers in the past, especially this guy Ingersoll, who is a folklorist with his ridiculous quote, they were sort of seen as junk, sort of just nobody. These were actions, sort of nonsensical actions by people who weren't thinking about things too hard. That they were just poor choices to leave all this stuff behind. But of course, if you're approaching these things with that angle, no one's going to tell you actual meaning. So we see all these items, and these do tie with beliefs of sort of the spirit and the afterlife. So we see a lot of water symbols, and water symbols are important. The whole passage across the water to Africa, but also in a lot of West African religions, the afterlife is associated with rivers or under river bottoms. So things like shells or pitchers or bowls to hold water, even hubcaps that sort of reflect the light, kind of like water does, those all tie in with those sort of afterlife symbols. Also, the flash of light on water is a visual cue for you as a visitor that an ancestor is present. And ancestors are very important because they can offer you guidance, they can give you strength and comfort. And so all of these reminders help you with your grief and help you with your community ties. So we got the shells to sort of help direct the spirit to the afterlife and under river to the water, or even back across the water to Africa. And then the spirit, we also leave their personal items behind to support them with their favorite quilt, or their little cup with a little dog on it, or their shaving mug, their medicine bottle, to keep your ancestors happy so they keep helping you, also to prevent them from following you home and causing you mischief. So all of these great things are tying into beliefs and social structures and family structures. They're not just garbage heaped upon a grave. They all mean something. They're also useful for me as an archaeologist because all of these objects are made within their time periods. We can tell when they were made, how much they were made, which helps us narrow down, like at the Gaynor Cemetery, where the collection of material items that I found there were definitely late 19th, early 20th century, helping me shift my interpretation that that was the post-emancipation cemetery rather than the enslaved community cemetery. So like I mentioned before, these old traditions are very important, especially if they're the some of the only things that can survive this upheaval of enslavement. But times change, and maybe you don't believe in the West African religious systems anymore. You adhere to more mainstream Christian faiths. So that spirit time might not be there, but the fact that these things are there sort of fit into your idea of what should be. So these are, we see Willie Gaynor's grave again. Other graves in this cemetery also had shells, and there was a lot of glass. And that may tie to the religious or the water-based religious themes that I spoke about before. But they made an impression. One of the descendant women, she told me my favorite story from this site. She said that there was a cemetery and there is a church on the same piece of property. And the church was also where they had Sunday school and regular school. And she said the only window in that church faced the cemetery, which was kind of terrifying for her as a child. She said until the sun came out, and the sun would hit all that glass and make the whole cemetery sparkle. And that was a very powerful memory for her that she still remembered decades later, which is very interesting and very always makes me emotional to think about that. Now, also, like many families in Florida, over time, the family moved. They started out in this central panhandle, and then they followed work down to the coast. And I visited the cemeteries that the descendants of these folk were buried in, and we see some of the traditions that they employed up there in Northern Bay County manifest in coastal Bay County. So we can see that the shells and the glass have changed slightly from the very obvious, that big orange shell container, probably for flowers, but instead of representing the flash of the spirit with the glass and the water, we see solar power garden lights, which is kind of cool. Now, solar power garden lights are used in a bunch of cemeteries, but in this particular cemetery, the only people that used it were the African-American community members. The white community members, they did not employ this tradition. So it spoke directly to that community. Also, instead of this blue bottle glass or the clear or the mirrored bottle glass, I saw a lot of these sort of the florist pebbles employed instead, which is, I guess, a little bit safer too than some of that glassware. So it's kind of a cool evolution of an aesthetic over time, keeping up with the ancestors, but making it a modern tradition. The other thing with using something like a cemetery, or like artifacts in a cemetery or as markers themselves, is that they're kind of tricky to make permanent. They move over time, which is frustrating for, again, for a modern person trying to track their genealogy, but it works well in that idea of there's always room for one more, because if it only lasts for a generation and then gets moved or kicked or whatever over time, that means that there's no finite boundary for that grave. If there's no finite boundary for that grave, there's room for somebody else to fit in. So it's frustrating when those clues go away, but it also goes back to that sense of wider community and celebration of community and making sure it stays together, which is really important and a really cool thing to think about and remember as you move forward and work with modern communities. So we have a lot of culturally specific ideas or clues about what makes an traditionally African-American cemetery an African-American cemetery. There's lots of slight variations that sort of pinpoint this about past actions, but we have to remember that these particular landscapes are also living landscapes. And there's modern people attached to them, modern stakeholders, modern evolutions of these people in the past. So we can approach cemeteries as museums, like we talk about, that they're sort of living museums about learning about people in the past, but they're also traditional cultural landscapes. And think about communities that either could never own property or lost property due to any number of the urban renewals that have gone through America's cities in the past, where there's no houses left anymore, there's no neighborhoods left anymore, but there might be a cemetery. So these places become more than just a collection of things. This becomes the last remnant sometimes of a whole way of life, a whole community. So we have to address this place as a living place. And we also have to look after it because African-American cemeteries are usually underrepresented and underreported. So looking after the sustainability of these places to ensure that they survive into the future is also important. So not just looking over the physical stuff, but looking at legal protections as well as maintaining traditions over time. So in North Carolina, my office, State Archaeology, and another agency, the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, have partnered up for a series of community-based workshops. And these workshops are the African American, Angela Thorpe at the African American Heritage Commission identified a number of different communities. And then we went to those communities and said, what are your biggest concerns about the cemeteries in your community? So these are the ones that we have established: Asheville, Charlotte, Elizabeth City, and New Bern. We have a couple more in the works, but those are the ones that are furthest along for me to talk about. The first one was Charlotte, down in the Biddleville neighborhood of Charlotte. We partnered with Congresswoman Adams, Alma Adams, from the Charlotte area. She's also one of the co-authors of the African American Burial Ground Network Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that's working its way through Congress that would provide money for research and study and that sort of thing. So her workshop in the Charlotte area ended up being very heavily focused on advocacy and the legal aspects of having a stronger voice in the legal proceedings to protect for historic preservation of cemeteries in the Mecklenburg, Charlotte area. It was a really well-attended workshop. We had about 75 people come. You can see the Congresswoman on the right there. And we spoke a lot about the laws and the words to use to bring a legal attention to protect these places. We had 2 more workshops scheduled right at the end of March and beginning of April. So those were immediately canceled. And we're moving them online. I'll have our Facebook page at the end. So if you're interested in attending our online workshops when they materialize, you will be invited. The first one was in Asheville. what's to be in Asheville. And there is the problem in the western part there was a disconnect between communities and researchers. The communities were starting to feel more like primary documents rather than living stakeholders, active stakeholders. So this workshop is going to be very heavily focused on recording and archival work, trying to teach people how to record the cemeteries and then act as a reintroduction between the African American community and available resources, local universities, local libraries, as well as state resources, to reconnect people so that instead of two different paths, we have people working together towards an active and inclusive historic preservation strategy. In the Elizabeth City State University workshop on the Northeast coast, that's going to be very focused on involving youth. So looking at college student work, as well as training them how to take care, so for cemetery maintenance. I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of cemetery work is is done by older volunteers who have more time on their hands. But this is something that we need to perpetuate about amongst younger groups. So we hope that by highlighting student work and showing students that this is something that's interesting and important and doable, that we can bring in a new audience and new players into this realm. And then the Newbern workshop is, we're partnering up with 4 or 5 different African American cemeteries, friends groups that have been working separately and struggling. So that workshop is going to be very heavily focused on heritage tourism, partnering up together. What do partnerships look like? And how we can move forward as a group, a coalition, rather than as individuals, to bring more attention and commemorate these places more broadly than trying to struggle alone. So lots of cool topics to approach this as an active space rather than a passive space. So we definitely will love to invite you guys along if you are interested. Our Facebook page is there on the upper right. I'll be posting information as those workshops pop up. And if you have any questions about engaging community members or our work to compare with the work that you're doing, or you have other questions, my contact information is on the upper left there, or you can reach out to the director of the African American Heritage Commission, Angela Thorpe. We work closely together, and we will find answers for you for the work we're doing and help you if you are deciding to take a path that way as well. And also reach out to FPAN, because I would not be doing this if I had not started doing this at FPAN. So they're a great resource as well. So I'm going to stop share because that is the end of my presentation. Again, thank FPAN for having me. And if there are questions, I am happy to answer them.
Yeah, great. That was awesome, Melissa. Such cool work that you continue to do. It looks like we've got a couple, at least one question. Let me bring up the chat. Where's it? Where to go? Okay, yeah. So we have from Nicholas. He's asking about the wooden markers. He says, what are the conditions, soil, weather, etc., under which these are more or less likely to have survived?
Obviously, the drier the better, because wood is tricky. In the Southeast, I know the soil is very acidic. The reason those ones that I showed survived was because those 2 cemeteries were very sandy and well-drained soils. The Gaynor Historical Cemetery is on a slight rise, so it's the ground penetrating radar that I ended up was beautiful because there was no moisture content in the soil, as well as this other cemetery where the 2 back-to-back were. So drier is better. It's tricky in the Southeast because it's dry nowhere. But yeah, any areas that you can find where there are slightly drier conditions would improve, much like any other natural material artifact would be if it's drier. I would imagine then conversely, very waterlogged would work as well. We do see some things, even in Pensacola on Deadman's Island, with submerged coffins that they survive because of the waterlogged environment. But yeah, much like any other wooden or paper or bone artifacts, drier or very, very dry or very, very wet.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. We just got a couple comments, but I noticed on the flyer for the workshop that there was what looked like a wooden marker on it. Is that what that was? It had like kind of a circular pattern at the
Yeah,
top.
that was the same one. That was the one from the Gaynor Historical Society. I just like that picture so much because it's such a, when I had that because that headstone, those headboards, they have the people shape, and then
Mhm.
there's usually a bit of a post at the bottom to stick into the ground. And the post on that one had split. So someone brought me the upper portion of it, and it was just like the best day to actually find one. And we were able to treat it at the UWF labs. And so I think it's still at the FPAN lab. But that was just one of my favorite finds from an African American cemetery. That and the little dog, the fragment of the dog mug, because that clearly was somebody's favorite. But we left all of those artifacts on site because we didn't want to disturb those memorials there. So I don't have that little piece of dog porcelain cup, but those two were my favorite. So that's why that was on there, was because it was a very strongly associated cultural marker of an African American cemetery.
And then Tamara, hey Tamara, I know you. She asks if you can state again which workshop is more focused on historic/heritage tourism.
Heritage tourism, that will be the New Bern one. We haven't rescheduled that one yet. The cool part about doing workshops online is that they are much more widely accessible, because we do plan on putting it on the North Carolina Department YouTube page. However, the other problem is, especially when doing a lot of community-based work, is accessibility of the things that make recording possible. So being able to ensure that these get recorded by all the people that we want to include, the community members we want to include, is something that we're working with right now. So we don't have a date for the New Bern workshop, but that's the one she's looking for the heritage tourism stuff.
And we have Carissa says some cemeteries have been encroached upon by modern development. Any hints to help volunteers distinguishing between grave goods and trash, particularly cups, bottles, etc.?
Sure, yeah, that gets tricky because some of it does look like trash. And I think the important thing is the big word in archaeology: context. If you can try to figure out about how old the cemetery is, looking for artifacts that fit that time period will give you a good clue. But if you have trouble identifying that, or you have questions, reach out to FPAN or reach out to the state office, and they will be able, send a picture with a scale of some sort, and ask for help. It's better to not assume than to pick it up. So I err on the side of everything's important in a cemetery, just in case. And then if later on you can identify this maybe is just like garbage, then go with that. So err on the side of caution and send for help if you can't distinguish.
And then Ethan has two questions. One, when placing material goods on graves, is there a pattern to where items are placed? So, like teacups always placed near the head. And then his second follow up question is, how often were cemetery floors swept?
I haven't seen a ton on placement I've seen some things like the use of, say, for example, the person died because they were ill. I've read a couple of cases where the medicine bottle from when they were sick, if it's not finished, they'd leave it at the cemetery so that the spirit of that ancestor doesn't try to go home to get their medicine. And so that would be upturned and close to the head. But as far as anything else goes, I don't know if I haven't seen specifically like an orientation of different things like that of specifically, or if it was more of an individual choice. What was the second question?
Yeah, sorry. The second question is, how often were cemetery floors swept?
Uh, the descendant family that I worked with in Bay County, it was at least once a year. Many of these African American cemeteries had like a cleanup day, a memorial type day that would happen once a year. But I think for them, that family, because the descendants, their father was also the cemetery maintenance guy. He was the one who made some of the headstones. So they did it periodically throughout the year, but many did it at least once a year.
Great. Yeah, I don't see any other questions on the chat. So, and we're right at 4:30. So I think it's a good spot to end with. So I just want to thank Melissa again for doing this. Please check out all those workshops that you mentioned that are coming up. It sounds like you've got a couple people that are already interested. And then also this talk will be put on our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that in our chat. But if you just go to youtube.com/Florida Public Archaeology Network, all spelled out as one word, that will take you to our page. And if you want to look under our playlist for Zoom into Archaeology, this one should be up probably either, well, I guess it's tomorrow's Friday, so it'll be early next week, probably Monday, I think is when we usually try to put those up. So if you missed, I know some people came in kind of late, so if you missed it, if you missed most of it, check out that link, and I'm sure you'll get an email follow up with that link in there. And so, as always, thanks again for showing up to this. I know we got a lot of regulars here. I think this was a nice break. I think regardless of how you voted, everybody's stressed out. So this is a nice little break from that. So really good information, and I hope you'll come back again, Melissa.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Well, y'all have a good evening, and then we'll see you next time for our Zoom into Archaeology.